The night was a blackened blur of rain, wind, and the distant hum of highway lights slicing through the misty fog. Route 47 stretched endlessly ahead, an isolated stretch of asphalt that seemed to vanish into nowhere, swallowed by the dense, relentless storm. The only thing visible were the heavy sheets of rain pouring down in unforgiving torrents, as if the sky itself had grown tired of the world below. It was the kind of night that felt like nature was demanding something from the earth, washing away the remnants of a long, drawn-out summer. And yet, Sarah Wellington, the epitome of control and sophistication, found herself trapped in this storm, in this forsaken moment, powerless. The Mercedes was the latest in a long line of impeccable machines, each one an extension of her personal empire. But right now, the sleek silver vehicle sat immobile, its engine sputtering and coughing like an aging animal clinging to life. Sarah slammed her palm onto the steering wheel in frustration, the sound of rain drumming steadily against the roof, amplifying her growing irritation. The car had been perfect just hours ago, humming with the smooth, confident power that mirrored her own life, always in motion, always advancing. But now, it was nothing more than a stubborn relic, its engine misfiring on a deserted highway, mocking her inability to fix it. She turned the key again, the familiar sound of the engine turning over and then cutting out like a sickly cough. The car groaned, as if pleading for mercy. She let out a sharp, frustrated breath, her fingers digging into the smooth leather of the steering wheel. Her heart rate quickened, not from the physical exertion, but from the sudden, inexplicable feeling of vulnerability that surged through her.
This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to her. Not tonight. She tried again. And again. Each turn of the key brought the same sputtering sound, an annoying mechanical failure that she had no power to fix. Not with money, not with influence, not with anything she had ever relied upon to make the world bend to her will. A tremor of panic crept up her spine. This was different. She was used to problems with clear solutions. Money, connections, her team, her assistants, her PR people. There was always someone there to smooth things over, to make sure that everything stayed on track. But right now, as the rain lashed against the windows, there was no one but her, alone in the dark, on the side of some God-forsaken road in the middle of nowhere, with a malfunctioning machine that was refusing to cooperate. Her mind began to spiral. The clock was ticking. She had a meeting in Chicago in less than 12 hours, a crucial meeting that would decide the future of her company. She needed to be there. She had to be there. She couldn't afford to miss this. Not after everything she'd fought for. She'd spent years clawing her way to the top of Wellington Foods, and this meeting was the final hurdle. The deal was critical. Her competitors, her board members, they were all counting on her. But the car was stubborn, and so was she. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles whitening. Her polished, expensive nails pressed into the leather, a futile attempt to steady herself. She tried again, her breath shallow as she turned the key. The engine coughed. Nothing. The dead weight of silence surrounded her. She wanted to scream, to smash the dashboard, to demand that the car simply do its job and get her to the city. But the car wasn't listening. And for the first time in years, neither was the world. Sarah glanced around, her gaze catching the distant lights of a small town in the far distance. Milbrook. It looked like a shadow on the horizon, small, insignificant. It wasn't a place she'd ever planned to visit. Certainly not tonight. Certainly not when she was about to close the biggest deal of her life. A knot of anxiety twisted in her chest. The helplessness of the situation, the isolation of it, began to gnaw at her. The frustration grew, suffocating her in a way she wasn't used to. Her empire, her power, her wealth. It all felt so distant in this moment. Everything she had built, all the control she'd fought so fiercely for, felt utterly useless now. She could buy anything, fix anything, except this. This small, frustrating moment where nothing would bend to her will. A sense of panic pressed against her ribs. She knew she couldn't be late. She couldn't afford to be. But how could she even get there? There was no one around, no roadside assistance, no one to help, just the sound of the rain, and the car, and her increasingly frantic thoughts. She picked up her phone, her fingers shaking slightly, but her mind was racing with thoughts of what to do. Call a tow truck? No, that would take too long. She couldn't risk it, not with the meeting. Her mind worked quickly. Maybe she could find someone in town who could help. The idea of a stranger in some rundown mechanic's garage, however, sent an involuntary shudder through her. But what else could she do? Sit here in the car all night? No. Her eyes darted back to the town's faint glow in the distance, and, against her will, the walls she had built around herself began to shift. She hated it. Hated the feeling of being at the mercy of something she couldn't control. Her lips pressed together in irritation, and she let out a long, slow breath, trying to calm herself. She couldn't lose control. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. But as she glanced again at the rain-soaked road ahead, she realized that no matter how powerful she was, there were still things in this world that couldn't be bent to her will, and that thought sent a deep, uncomfortable wave of frustration through her body. She took a final, long glance at the Mercedes, her eyes narrowing as the weight of the situation settled fully over her. There was no more room for control. The storm outside seemed to mock her, loud, relentless, unstoppable. It was nature's reminder that no matter how polished, how perfect, how powerful her world had become, sometimes there were forces at play that no one could change. With a clenched jaw and a deep sigh, she unlocked the door and stepped out into the storm, the cold rain instantly soaking through her designer suit. The chill of it hit her like a physical blow, but she barely noticed, her mind already calculating her next move. Find help. Get to the meeting. Nothing else mattered. But as she walked toward the distant glow of the small town, Sarah Wellington, a woman who had conquered the world with her sheer will, couldn't help but feel the faintest stir of something she never allowed herself to feel: doubt. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. Sarah's frustration grew in waves, each turn of the key more desperate than the last. The engine sputtered, coughed, then fell silent again. She slammed the palm of her hand against the steering wheel, the sharp sound of it swallowed by the hammering rain. She could feel the tension coil in her shoulders, the knot tightening with every failed attempt to start the car. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being this powerless. The Mercedes, the one she had hand-picked, the one that had always responded to her commands, was failing her. I can't believe this is happening, she thought, her fingers still clutching the cold, smooth steering wheel, unwilling to let go. Why now? Why tonight? She glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 9:32 p.m. That gave her just under 11 hours to get to Chicago. She needed to be there. There was no option, no other path. The board meeting, the merger, the future of Wellington Foods. Her mind reeled at the weight of what was slipping through her fingers, the chance to finalize the deal that would solidify her reputation, her legacy. If she missed this, if she didn't get to the meeting, She couldn't fathom what it would mean. The thought made her stomach tighten, a raw pulse of panic under the calm exterior she prided herself on maintaining. She turned the key once more, the engine sputtering and dying almost immediately. This time she didn't even curse. She knew it was pointless. It wasn't going to work. A wave of helplessness washed over her, a feeling so alien to her it made her breath catch. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay composed. She was Sarah Wellington, CEO of one of the most successful food companies in the country. Her every decision was scrutinized, but she had always been able to bend the world to her will. Money, influence, power, she had them all. She could get anything she wanted, make anything happen. Except this simple mechanical breakdown. It had the audacity to make her feel small. Her eyes darted to the horizon, the lights of Milbrook twinkling faintly in the distance, barely visible through the storm. There was a town, a small town tucked away in the darkness. And in that town, there had to be someone who could help her. But admitting it, the idea of walking into a dingy garage, of asking for help, it felt like a crack in the flawless armor she had spent years constructing. It wasn't supposed to be like this. People didn't help Sarah Wellington. They worked for her, followed her lead, bent to her will. She didn't ask for help.
She pressed her fingers against her temple, feeling the sharp throb of frustration start to settle behind her eyes. The thought of making a call, of asking for a tow truck, left a bitter taste in her mouth. Her mind raced through the options, trying to organize a solution. A tow truck would take at least an hour to arrive. And then what? The car would need repairs? Maybe they could patch it up temporarily, enough to get her on the road, but could she trust that? What if the car failed again? No, she thought, her grip tightening on the wheel. She couldn't risk it, not with the meeting tomorrow. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her legs were starting to cramp from being in the same position for so long. The rain continued to lash at the windows in rhythmic bursts, mocking her stillness, her inaction. And then, as the rain picked up even more, a strange thought formed, something uncharacteristic, something she would never have entertained before. What if I just go to town? What if I find someone who can actually fix this? It felt like a betrayal to herself. Asking for help was like admitting defeat, like saying, I'm not strong enough to do this on my own. She had built her empire from nothing, fought tooth and nail for every inch of success, and here she was, on the side of a lonely highway, stranded. Her pulse quickened, her pride flaring. No, I don't need to ask anyone for anything. I'll just fix this myself. I'll figure it out. But she knew better. The car wasn't something she could fix with a quick phone call to a mechanic or a few $100. She could feel it deep in her gut now. The helplessness was real. And the truth was even worse. In this situation, all her wealth and connections meant nothing. No amount of money could make the engine turn over. And then, a tiny voice, softer but insistent, echoed in her mind. You're not in control anymore. It was almost laughable. How many times had she sat in boardrooms, commanding respect, wielding power with ease? How many people had she manipulated, controlled, bent to her will? Yet here, on this wet, deserted road, she was at the mercy of a car engine. And no amount of money, no amount of power could change that. Her jaw tightened, and she glanced out the window again. Milbrook. It wasn't even a proper town by her standards, just a small speck in the middle of nowhere. She didn't belong here. She shouldn't be here. But the world was laughing at her, wasn't it? The universe, in all its infinite wisdom, was reminding her of one undeniable truth. You are not invincible. The weight of that realization settled heavily on her chest, making her heart beat just a little faster. This moment, the rain, the silence, the helplessness,
reminded her in a way she hadn't been reminded in years of how fragile her power truly was. For once, there was no one to push around, no one to dictate, not even her. With a frustrated sigh, she swung the door open. The chill air hit her like a slap in the face, cold and biting, cutting through the sleek fabric of her designer suit. She stood there for a moment, stunned by the sensation of the rain immediately soaking through her silk blouse, the icy sting of water running down her skin. She took one step, then another, each one a painful reminder that she was stepping into unfamiliar territory, both physically and mentally. Her high-end designer shoes sank slightly into the wet asphalt, the heels sinking into the muck. The familiar sound of her well-heeled steps was gone, replaced by the squelching noise of water-soaked leather. The puddles splashed as she moved, her perfectly tailored pants clinging to her legs, ruined in a way that made her skin crawl. She couldn't help but feel the stark contrast between the muddy, cold ground beneath her and the world she had just left behind, a world where her feet never touched anything that wasn't spotless, pristine. The thought that she was now standing here, drenched and uncomfortable, was almost surreal. She hated this feeling, hated it. The feeling of losing control. The feeling of being out of place. She hated the cold, hated the rain, hated the fact that her whole existence, her carefully constructed, perfectly polished life, was suddenly irrelevant in the face of something as small as a car engine refusing to start. But there was no turning back, no escaping the situation. The sooner she accepted that the world wasn't hers to command, the sooner she could get back to work. Her eyes flickered back toward Milbrook. She didn't belong here, but maybe, just this once, she'd have to let someone else take control. With a tight, resigned breath, she pulled her coat tighter around herself and made her way toward the distant lights, her mind already working on the next step, the next move. There had to be a mechanic in town. There had to be someone who could get her back on the road, someone who could fix her mess. And with each step, the cold water seeping into her shoes, Sarah Wellington allowed herself to acknowledge the undeniable truth. For the first time in years, there was no control left to claim. Sarah stepped out of the car and stood there for a moment, the rain pounding against the back of her neck, her once immaculate designer shoes now soaked through. She could feel the biting cold beginning to seep into her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already at work, assessing her next move. She needed a solution, something quick. The dark, wet night stretched ahead, and the lights from the garage loomed in the distance, barely visible through the misty rain, offering the only hope of escape from her increasingly frustrating situation. As Sarah approached the entrance, her heels clicking loudly on the pavement, she couldn't help but feel the tension building in her chest. The garage wasn't what she had expected. It wasn't even close. The small, weathered building stood at the edge of town like a relic from another time, its faded sign swaying in the wind, the words barely legible. Jackson Auto Repair, fair prices, honest work. Sarah sneered slightly. Fair price? A line like that had no place in her world of luxury and expense accounts. She had no use for honest work. To her, it sounded quaint, an antiquated notion, something that belonged in a different, much simpler world. She pulled the door open, a rusty screech echoing through the space, and stepped inside, immediately assaulted by the sharp, pungent smell of motor oil and stale coffee. The air was thick with it, heavy and overwhelming. Her nostrils flared in disgust. The garage was dimly lit. The flickering fluorescent bulbs barely illuminated the cluttered, chaotic space. Wrenches, tools, and oil-soaked rags were strewn haphazardly across workbenches and the cement floor, like an explosion of activity frozen in time. It was a mess, disorganized and neglected, a far cry from the sterile, meticulously ordered world Sarah inhabited, where everything had its place, and every task, every meeting, every moment was planned down to the last detail.
"What am I even doing here?" she thought. This place, this whole town felt beneath her. Her polished heels, her tailored suit, the carefully styled hair, all of it felt out of place in this rundown corner of the world. She glanced around with disdain, taking in the cluttered shelves and the thick layer of dust covering the floor. The scent of diesel fuel clung to the walls, and somewhere in the corner a radio played a crackling country song, the music too soft to make out. Her eyes narrowed. This was the world she had fought against, a world of grit, of grease under fingernails, of people who didn't understand the power of money or influence. She had climbed to the top of her world, every step measured, every move deliberate. And now here she was, on the edge of it all, forced to walk into a place like this, a place where nobody cared about her title, her name, or her wealth. A place where she was just another person, stranded in the rain, looking for help. She took a deep breath, stifling the wave of frustration that threatened to bubble over. This was beneath her. But she didn't have a choice. She had to make it work. She needed to get the car fixed, and then she could go back to her world, back to control. Her gaze drifted across the room, her eyes landing on a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing grease-stained coveralls, his back hunched as he worked under the hood of a rusted pickup truck. His hair was short and curly, the dark strands messy but not unkempt. He had an air of quiet competence about him, a no-nonsense demeanor that radiated from every inch of him. He looked like he belonged here, in this greasy, dimly lit space. It was as if this room, this life was his own, its rhythm as natural to him as breathing. As Sarah stepped further into the garage, she instinctively straightened, brushing invisible wrinkles from her suit, her mind already assessing the situation, the man, everything. He's just a mechanic, she told herself. He fixes cars. That's all. But as he stood up, wiping his hands with a rag and turning to face her, she immediately noticed the calm in his posture. He wasn't rattled by her presence, wasn't scrambling to prove anything. His eyes met hers without hesitation, an easy confidence in them, like he was perfectly comfortable with who he was and where he was. Sarah's first instinct was to judge him. She wanted to. This man, with his worn coveralls and heavy boots, was clearly used to getting his hands dirty, used to the rough-and-tumble life that Sarah had spent years distancing herself from. She, on the other hand, had never had to get her hands dirty. She had people for that. Her world was about power and influence, about people bending to her will. This man was a stark contrast. "Trouble, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low and steady, tinged with warmth, though his eyes were sharp and clear. Sarah's gaze flickered over him, and despite herself, she felt an odd pang of irritation. His calmness, the way he regarded her without even a hint of nervousness or deference, was like a mirror, reflecting her own discomfort, her own unease. She was used to being the one in control, the one who set the tone of every interaction. But this man, this mechanic, was unaffected by her presence, unbothered by the rich, powerful woman standing before him, and that, more than anything, grated on her. She fought to keep her voice even. "The car broke down. I need it fixed. Quickly." The words came out clipped, more impatient than she intended. She could feel her frustration rising again, the way the situation was slipping from her control, and it irked her in a way that was hard to suppress.
The mechanic didn't seem to flinch. He just nodded, as if her demand were perfectly normal, something he dealt with all the time. He didn't bow to her, didn't flatter her with empty pleasantries, and that stung. His hands, calloused and rough, moved easily across the bench, grabbing a set of tools with a practiced precision. He didn't rush, didn't give her that look of helplessness or confusion that she was used to from people who didn't know how to deal with her authority. "Let me take a look," he said, his tone soft but firm. As he walked toward her car, Sarah's mind raced, and for the briefest moment, she found herself at a loss for words. She was used to people, especially men, being intimidated by her, used to them trying to impress her, flatter her, play into her hands. But here, this man wasn't doing that. He wasn't impressed. He wasn't scared. She watched as he opened the hood, the rain drenching him as he stood in it, unbothered by the cold. His focus was entirely on the car, the machine in front of him, not on her expensive suit, her perfectly manicured nails, or her title. The air between them felt thick with unspoken tension. He didn't care about her power, didn't care about her wealth, and for some reason, that struck Sarah in a way she couldn't explain. It was like a cold splash of water, reminding her that in this moment, none of that mattered.
Her fingers clenched into fists, her impatience bubbling just under the surface, but she held it in check. This man wasn't like the others, and for some reason, that made her uneasy in a way she hadn't expected. "Not much I can do in this weather," he said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, as he glanced up at her, his eyes meeting hers with a steady confidence that only made Sarah feel more out of place. She opened her mouth to protest. She didn't do helplessness. She didn't wait for anything. But something in the way he stood, unshaken, unhurried, stopped her. Her irritation flared, but she tamped it down. She didn't have time for this. She needed the car fixed. But as she watched Michael step back from the engine, wiping his hands on his rag, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the car anymore. There was something about him, his calmness, that made her feel a little more uncertain than she liked, and that made her angry. The sound of the engine sputtering again echoed in Sarah's ears, its rhythmic cough a harsh reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. It was maddening. This was beneath her, beneath everything she had worked for. She wasn't supposed to be here, standing in this damp, gritty garage, staring at a stubborn mechanic whose indifference to her power was beginning to gnaw at her. Sarah's fingers gripped the leather steering wheel tighter. The rain outside was relentless, beating against the walls of the small garage like a constant reminder of her frustration. The car had died again, and Michael was still fiddling under the hood, his calm demeanor completely at odds with the frantic pace of her thoughts. She glanced at the clock on her phone, 9:42 p.m. It was ticking away faster than she was willing to admit, and with every minute that passed, her stress mounted. She had a meeting tomorrow. Not just any meeting, a pivotal, career-defining moment, the kind of meeting where failure wasn't an option. If she didn't make it, if she didn't show up on time, there would be repercussions she couldn't even begin to predict. People's jobs, the future of the company, her future, were all hanging in the balance. She couldn't afford to waste another second. But here she was, standing in the middle of a garage filled with rusted tools and old tires, with a man who clearly didn't understand the urgency of her situation. He didn't care. How could he not care? Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts quickening as she formulated a plan. She didn't need to get upset. She didn't need to lose control. All she needed to do was fix the car. She was Sarah Wellington, CEO of Wellington Foods, a woman who had made billions with her strategic mind and relentless drive. She was accustomed to using her influence, her wealth, to solve problems. This should have been no different. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete, her voice controlled but sharp. "Listen, I need to be in Chicago by tomorrow morning. A meeting with the board. It's crucial. If you can't fix this immediately, I'll make it worth your while. I'll pay double, triple, Whatever it takes to get this car on the road.
Michael, who had been quietly inspecting the engine, didn't even flinch. His eyes didn't shift from the task at hand, and his hands continued their work with a calm efficiency that only seemed to irritate Sarah more. She wasn't used to people ignoring her, especially when money was on the table. But there he was, this mechanic, with his worn coveralls and grease-streaked face, standing in her way as if he were immune to the power of her words. She took a deep breath, her voice rising just a touch. "I don't think you understand," she said, her words measured but insistent. "This isn't just some casual request. This is important. I don't have time to wait. I'll make sure you're compensated for your trouble. Just get it done." Still, he didn't look up. Sarah's heart began to pound in her chest. How could he be so unmoved? She was offering him more money than he could possibly need, more than he had likely seen in a year of working in that grimy garage. And yet he was still refusing. Sarah's mind churned as she processed what was happening. This was insane. She was used to making things happen, getting results, using whatever leverage she had to bend the world to her will. It was how she had built her empire. It was how she survived. She could make anything happen, solve any problem, if she just had enough power, enough resources. But here, in this rundown garage, standing in front of a man whose life was a million miles from hers, nothing she had to offer seemed to matter. Not her money, not her influence. Her thoughts became a blur of disbelief and growing frustration. What was this? Was this some sort of test? Was Michael deliberately pushing her buttons? He couldn't be this insensitive, could he? People always responded to money. That was how the world worked, wasn't it? Her wealth was a shield, a tool, a symbol of everything she could accomplish.
Her pulse quickened, the realization settling coldly in her stomach. Why was he ignoring me? She had expected him to take the money, nod his head, and quickly get to work. But instead, he was standing there, focused on a car engine, as though she were just another person asking for help, as though her demands meant no more than the hundreds of others who came to him with their broken-down vehicles. His refusal felt like a slap, an affront. She was used to people needing her, to her influence shaping the way people reacted to her. She was used to demanding results. But here, in this small, unremarkable garage, she was no longer the one in control. For the first time in years, she was at someone else's mercy, and that realization twisted in her chest. She took another step forward, trying once more to command the situation. "I'm offering you more than fair compensation for your time," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, though the irritation slipped through the cracks. "You'll be well paid. I'll even give you a bonus for expediting the work. Just fix the damn car." Michael didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, his expression unchanged, almost as though he hadn't even heard her. "I can't rush it, ma'am," he said, his voice steady, unhurried. "Your car's engine is beyond a quick fix. If I try to patch it up now, you'll be stranded again. It's not worth the risk." The words hit her like a jolt of ice water. The audacity of him to stand there, looking at her with calm, unyielding eyes, while her world, the world she had built, threatened to collapse around her. Her mouth went dry. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She was Sarah Wellington, for God's sake. She didn't wait. She didn't beg. People moved when she told them to move. And yet, here she was, in a rundown garage, a mere mechanic turning down her offer. Michael's refusal was baffling. It was frustrating. But more than that, it was humbling. She hated the feeling that rose up inside her, clawing at her insides. Humbling. A word she hadn't had to use in years,
if ever. He doesn't need my money. The thought pierced through her mind, sharper than she expected. It wasn't just that he refused her money, it was that he wasn't interested in it. To him, her wealth, her power, her reputation meant nothing. He didn't want to be part of her world. He wasn't willing to bend to her will. For the first time, Sarah felt something shift inside her, a seed of doubt planted in the soil of her certainty. Was that what she had been? A person who only valued others based on what they could do for her? Was that all she was? She felt her chest tighten, but she couldn't shake the feeling. Michael wasn't impressed by her. He wasn't trying to gain anything from her, wasn't making small talk to win her favor. It was as if he had no fear of her, no interest in pleasing her. He was just a mechanic doing his job, and doing it well by the looks of it. His refusal didn't come from a place of anger or disrespect, but from a place of confidence, the kind of confidence Sarah hadn't seen in anyone in a long time, not since she was young, before she had the world at her feet. Her frustration grew, but so did something else, something she couldn't quite place. Michael's calm, unshakable stance, his refusal to let her dictate terms, made her feel small in a way she couldn't ignore.
I don't know how to handle this, she thought, a crack forming in her carefully maintained armor. Her words, now a little softer, though still laced with impatience, came out through clenched teeth. I don't think you understand the urgency of this. I'm offering you a lot of money, Michael. Just get the car fixed. He glanced at her for a brief second, meeting her gaze with unwavering calm. Ma'am, I told you, some things can't be rushed. His words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah Wellington didn't know what to say. Sarah shifted uneasily from foot to foot, her expensive heels clicking softly against the concrete floor of the dimly lit garage. The sound echoed in the otherwise quiet space, amplifying the isolation that seemed to stretch out around her. The air was thick with the scent of motor oil, grease, and something older, more permanent, a kind of stubbornness that clung to the walls, to the tools, to the very bones of the place. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, their buzz like an annoying, constant hum that matched the rising irritation in her chest. She crossed her arms tightly, unwilling to let go of her stance, but it was more for appearance than comfort now. The tailored cut of her suit, the high-end fabric that had once felt so perfectly in place, now felt almost too pristine, too perfect in this place. She glanced around the garage again. The clutter of tools, the worn wooden shelves stacked high with parts, the car parts scattered on the workbench. It was like nothing Sarah had ever been part of. This was a world of mess, of disarray, a world where cleanliness and precision were secondary to function. It was alien to her, a world she had no part in, and yet here she was, standing in the middle of it, forced to wait, forced to be. The tension in her jaw tightened as she tapped her foot impatiently, the heel of her shoe clicking against the hard floor with each anxious movement. Her mind raced, processing every minute that passed. Every second felt like an eternity. It was 9:15 p.m. now. The clock in her mind ticked louder than any clock in the room. Get back on the road, she thought. Get back to Chicago. Get back in control. But she wasn't in control here. Not anymore. Sarah glanced over at Michael, who was still working on the car, completely unfazed by her presence. His focus remained steady, his hands moving with a calm, practiced precision. He wasn't rushing. He didn't need to. His every move was deliberate, unhurried, as though the world itself was moving at a pace he had long since accepted. He worked with a kind of confidence that Sarah found strange.
She caught herself staring, wondering how someone like him could be so calm in the face of what, to her, was an urgent, frantic situation. How could someone like him, a mechanic in a dirty, cluttered garage, be so completely unaffected by the urgency, the demands, the ticking clock that was racing in Sarah's mind? How can he be so calm? The question lingered, unspoken, and she couldn't shake it. There he was, working on the engine of her car, his back slightly hunched under the hood, not looking at her, not asking her a single thing about her life or her world. He wasn't distracted by the delicate fabrics of her suit, by her designer shoes, by her high-powered title. He wasn't trying to impress her, to win her approval. He wasn't looking for anything from her, and it bothered her more than she cared to admit. Her patience, already thin, snapped for a moment as she sighed, her arms folding tighter across her chest. Her eyes darted back to the car, her mind already running through the possibilities. She needed to get to Chicago. She needed to get back into her world, into the rhythm of meetings and presentations, of deals being made, of making decisions that affect hundreds of people, of having every aspect of her life calculated, controlled, planned. But none of that mattered here. In this garage, none of her carefully crafted control mattered. None of her money, her status, her reputation. She could offer him anything, money, connections, anything. But it wasn't working. It wasn't enough. And that realization settled in her gut like a slow burn. What am I doing here? Her thoughts spiraled back to her life, the world she'd left behind, where things moved at her pace, where she had power over every minute, every second. Board meetings at 7 a.m., phone calls with clients at 9, endless schedules, endless demands. The pace of her life was fast, no time to slow down, no time to breathe. Her schedule was a relentless drumbeat, every second accounted for, every decision made with precision. She could trace her life back in seconds. Meetings, numbers, targets, deals. Relationships? Fleeting at best. The few she had were transactional. The people around her, associates, colleagues, friends, were just parts of the system, pieces to be moved. She didn't have time for anything else. She didn't have time for connection. I don't have time for this, she thought, looking around at the cluttered space again. For these people, this place. It wasn't supposed to be like this. This wasn't the world she had built, the world she had fought for, the world where everything, everyone was under her control. Her mind drifted to her office, the glass walls, the sleek modern furniture, the towering skyline visible from the window. It had been designed for one thing: perfection. There were no corners out of place in her office, no cracks in the floor, no dust on the shelves. Everything was clean, pristine, controlled. The glass was reflective, giving her the illusion of space, of air. But looking back, she realized how suffocating it had become. Even her home, her high-rise apartment, was the same: minimalist, efficient, sterile. The sterile beauty of it all made it feel empty. There was no warmth there, no clutter, no mess. It was an empty perfection, an illusion of life. And yet here, in this garage, in this cluttered, imperfect space, she felt a strange stirring, an unfamiliar sense of warmth in the midst of the chaos. Michael was comfortable here. It was his domain. The clutter didn't bother him. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just being. He was grounded in a way she hadn't felt in years.
As her thoughts began to circle, her frustration built again. How could she have missed this? Her entire life had been a carefully curated illusion of success and control, and for the first time, she was seeing the cracks in her own world. She couldn't help but wonder if she had been running so fast toward something that she had missed everything else, everything
that mattered. Everything that was real. How did I get here? A twinge of doubt crept up in the back of her mind, the kind of doubt she'd never allowed herself to feel, the kind that made her question everything she thought she knew about life, about success. Her thoughts were interrupted when Michael spoke, his voice calm, steady, not rushed. "Ma'am, I'm afraid your car won't be ready tonight. It's going to take more than a quick fix." The words landed like a stone in the pit of her stomach. Her pulse quickened, her mind racing again. She opened her mouth to protest. She couldn't afford to waste more time. She had no time left. But something in his tone, the way he was looking at her, stopped her. There was no judgment in his gaze, no impatience. He simply stated the facts, offering nothing but honesty. His calmness in the face of her rising frustration disarmed her, and she felt a sudden shift, a subtle tension running through her chest. This was a test of a kind, wasn't it? A test not just of her patience, but of her ability to accept the world as it was, without control, without manipulation. For once, she wasn't the one calling the shots, and that realization hit her with an uncomfortable finality. Her lips pressed together in a thin line. "This is ridiculous," she thought. "I don't need to be here." But deep down, something inside her knew that this garage, this man, this moment, was exactly where she needed to be.
The quiet rhythm of the garage, once a constant hum of mechanical work and the low buzz of fluorescent lights, suddenly shifted. A small voice, high-pitched and sweet, cut through the air. "Daddy!" Sarah's head snapped to the side, her irritation at the situation still simmering, but the sound of that voice caught her off guard. She hadn't expected anyone else, certainly not a child, to appear in this dingy, dim-lit place. Her gaze landed on a young girl, her figure framed by the threshold of the garage, her raincoat a bright splash of yellow against the muted gray of the night outside. The girl was small, probably no older than 7, with messy brown curls tumbling around her face. Her eyes were wide and full of curiosity, a stark contrast to the jaded, hardened look Sarah had developed over the years. The child's boots, coated in mud from the storm, made soft, squelching sounds as she walked, her small feet navigating the cluttered space with practiced ease. "Daddy!" The girl's voice rang out again, this time a little more eager, a little more hopeful. Michael looked up from under the hood of the car, a smile breaking across his face as he greeted her with a gentle, quiet affection. "Hey, sweetie. How was school today?" The simplicity of the exchange struck Sarah immediately. It wasn't just the softness in Michael's voice, it was the absolute calm in the way he spoke to his daughter, as though the world outside this garage didn't exist. There was no urgency, no underlying stress, just a steady, unquestionable bond between them. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her arms instinctively crossing over her chest. She wasn't used to this kind of connection, so open, so easy. She had never really known what it felt like to be present in the moment. Her entire life had been about pushing, striving, and keeping things moving forward. Every second of her day was a battle to stay ahead, to stay in control. And here, in this quiet little garage, was a father who gave no care to the ticking clock or the pressures of the outside world. How can he be so calm? The thought floated into Sarah's mind, almost involuntarily. How can he just stop? She watched, her expression unreadable, as Michael kneeled down beside the girl, wiping his hands on a rag before gently brushing a lock of hair out of her face. The tenderness between them was palpable, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a strange knot form in her chest, a mix of longing and discomfort she couldn't immediately place. The girl, Emma, was clearly fond of her father, her gaze fixed on him with such admiration and trust that it left Sarah feeling hollow in comparison.
She was used to being admired, used to people looking up to her, but this was different. This wasn't about power or influence. This was pure, unfiltered connection, the kind of connection Sarah hadn't allowed herself to nurture in years. "You're fixing the car, right, Daddy?" Emma asked, her voice small but filled with hope. "That's right," Michael said, his tone warm, steady. He didn't look at Sarah. There was no deference, no need to acknowledge her presence, but it didn't matter. He was speaking to his daughter, sharing a world with her that felt completely removed from the tension swirling in Sarah's chest. "It will all be ready soon." Sarah watched them, her gaze lingering on the way Michael's eyes softened as he looked at his daughter, the way his entire body seemed to relax when she spoke. It was as though everything else in the world faded out of view for him. There was no stress, no hurry, no competition, just this small moment of connection. And yet here Sarah was, a woman who had built her life around rushing, around achieving, and suddenly she felt like an intruder in their quiet, uncomplicated bond. "This is what I've been missing," she thought, though she didn't quite recognize the thought for what it was. It was an ache, a small, almost imperceptible sting in her chest that deepened as she watched the interaction unfold.
The realization was uncomfortable. The life Sarah had spent so long building, the walls she had erected around her, all of it suddenly felt hollow. She had spent years focusing on success, on power, status, wealth, and yet here was Michael, in this small garage, surrounded by tools, dirt, and grease, without the need for any of it. He had something simpler, something more fundamental, a connection. She shifted awkwardly, suddenly aware of how disconnected she was from this moment. Her arms still crossed, her foot tapping nervously, she looked away, only to find her eyes landing on the clutter of the garage once more. The tools, the rags, the half-finished projects, it all seemed so real, so alive, in a way that her sterile, air-conditioned office or her meticulously curated apartment never had been. As Michael straightened up, wiping his hands on his coveralls, Emma tugged gently at his sleeve again. "Are you coming home soon?" she asked, the question innocent, a simple request filled with the pure expectation that her father would be there when she needed him. Michael's smile was warm and easy, a slow, patient curve of his lips. "I'll be home in a little bit, Emma. Why don't you go inside and get something to eat? I'll be right behind you." Emma hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her small hand brushing the side of his arm as she turned to leave, her boots clicking softly against the floor. As she disappeared into the house, the warmth in the garage seemed to dim, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that lingered in the air, the feeling of something simple, something real. Michael stood up fully, stretching his back, and then turned to Sarah, the calm of the moment still holding in his voice, as he addressed her. "We'll get it fixed. Don't worry. It'll just take a little more time." Sarah stared at him for a moment, her mouth dry. There was something in his eyes, something that made her feel small, like she didn't quite belong in this space. She had come into the garage expecting to be in control, expecting to throw money at the problem and get back on her way. But here, in this world, none of that mattered. None of it was even necessary. She cleared her throat, suddenly aware of the silence between them. "Of course," she said, her voice tight, the words coming out with an odd sense of reluctance. The dissonance between her world and his was undeniable, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't have the answer. As she stood there, feeling the last vestiges of her control slipping away, Sarah realized that there was no simple solution to her problem. There was no quick fix, no fast-track method to force things into alignment. Not here, not in this space. And it was the first time, in a very long time, that Sarah Wellington had felt the weight of that truth. As the night stretched on, Sarah began to feel the weight of time press more heavily on her shoulders. The garage had transformed in her mind.
No longer just a cramped, dingy place, but now a kind of sanctuary. A space where the noise of the outside world couldn't reach her. A space that was still and full of an unexpected calm. Despite her inner urgency, despite the ticking clock reminding her of the board meeting tomorrow, something about the simplicity of the moment, this garage, this place, began to work on her, quietly, slowly. Michael had gone back to work under the hood of the car, his movements fluid, as if he were accustomed to the noise, the mess, and the solitude. Sarah's arms were still crossed tightly across her chest, as if somehow holding on to her own sense of control, her own defensive posture, despite the unraveling feeling inside her. Her foot tapped restless, but her eyes, instead of bouncing from place to place, lingered on him. There was a quiet steadiness to him that was starting to unsettle her, because no matter how much she tried to distance herself, she couldn't ignore the pull of his calm.
It was something subtle, a quiet strength, a kind of confidence in simply being. He didn't need to fill the space with words, didn't need to impress her. He was just present. As her thoughts drifted, her gaze slipped to a shelf in the corner of the room where a few family photos rested among the clutter. Sarah didn't expect much from them, just a small, humble display that belonged to a man who worked with his hands. But one photo caught her attention, perched slightly crooked on the shelf. It was of Michael and his daughter, Emma, at what looked like a small-town fair. There were no bright city lights, no backdrop of glossy, staged perfection, just the soft glow of twilight and a simple moment frozen in time. Michael was laughing, his arm around Emma's shoulder, his eyes sparkling with a quiet joy. Emma's face was pressed against his, her small hands clutching the edges of his shirt. They were completely unaware of anything but each other in that moment, and it was that very intimacy that drew Sarah's eyes. Her heart gave a small, unexpected tug. For the first time in a long while, she found herself wishing for something like that, a moment that wasn't calculated, that didn't come with strings attached, a moment where people could simply be happy. Her thoughts briefly flickered back to her own life, but this time it wasn't a comparison about her childhood or the calculated relationship she'd built. It was something else, a realization, quiet and slow like the rain falling steadily outside. She wasn't used to that kind of simplicity. It was too simple, too real. Sarah's life had been full of deals, meetings, and performance. Everything had a purpose. Every relationship, every interaction was a transaction. She had learned that early on. But here, in the soft glow of that photo, Sarah realized that for all her accomplishments, for all the people she had in her life, she had never had this simple, unconditional bond. The photo wasn't just a family snapshot. It was a testament to a kind of love that existed beyond what she could see or control, beyond her understanding.
The walls she had spent years building inside herself, walls of power, efficiency, and control, seemed to falter in the face of that photo. She could feel them weakening, and it both unsettled and intrigued her. She didn't know why she was even allowing herself to feel this, to question what she had always believed about what mattered. The entire basis of her life, her success, had been rooted in the idea that achievement and control were the highest forms of existence. But now, as she stood there in the quiet garage, she felt the first whispers of doubt. What if there's more than this? Her thoughts briefly wandered to her own home, her office, places she had meticulously curated to reflect her success. The glass walls of her penthouse apartment, the polished wood of her office, the sleek lines of the furniture. They were all designed to be perfect, to impress. But standing here, in a space that was untidy and grounded, Sarah couldn't help but feel the emptiness of her carefully constructed life. The pristine beauty of her apartment, the empty dinners at her expensive table,
all felt disconnected from the warmth and depth she saw in Michael and Emma's lives. Was it enough? She shifted uncomfortably on her feet, feeling the strange weight of that question pressing into her chest. She hadn't wanted to confront it. She hadn't wanted to admit it. But here, in the middle of this mechanic's garage, watching a father and daughter share something simple, something real, Sarah couldn't deny it any longer. Michael's quiet confidence, the way he navigated his world without the need for validation, made her uneasy. He wasn't just surviving, he was living. He was whole. As Michael glanced over at her, catching her gaze briefly, something about the look in his eyes made her throat tighten. He wasn't judging her. He wasn't sizing her up like so many others did. He didn't seem to care what she wore, or who she was, or what she could offer him. He was just there, existing in his own world. And for a fleeting second, Sarah felt an unfamiliar tug toward that simplicity. She had always believed that she was in control of everything around her, that her ability to strategize, to plan, was what kept her world intact. But now, standing here, feeling the pull of something unplanned, something uncalculated, Sarah felt something stirring inside her, something she had long buried under layers of ambition and work. Why am I here? The question floated in her mind again, softer this time. She had come here to fix a problem, to get back on the road, to continue her march toward the meeting tomorrow. But now, she couldn't escape the feeling that this moment, this place, was asking her to confront something much deeper, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. As she stood there, her arms still crossed tightly, her foot no longer tapping, Sarah realized that the quiet shift inside her was more than just an inconvenience. It was a reckoning. She couldn't keep pretending that the world she had created was the only way to live. There was more, something beyond the control she had relied on for so long. But could she embrace it? Michael, still working, finally turned to her and gave a brief nod. "It's going to take a bit longer, but we'll get you on your way." His voice was steady, not rushed, not apologetic. There was no pressure, no expectation, just a simple truth. Sarah took a deep breath, her chest tight with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite place. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words stuck. For once, she didn't have the answer, and that felt more real than anything she'd ever done before. The small-town diner was a world away from the cold, sterile restaurants Sarah had grown accustomed to. The rickety chairs creaked beneath her, and the table was so close to the one next to it that she could hear every word of the conversation happening there. It was a tight space, cramped with the smell of freshly baked pie, sizzling bacon, and the comforting aroma of home-cooked meals that Sarah rarely had time to enjoy. She wasn't used to the hum of normal life, the unpretentious noise of people simply being together, eating, talking. Michael and Emma had already dug into their meals, the simple, familiar ritual of eating together, a routine Sarah had long forgotten. As she sat there, spooning the lukewarm tomato soup into her mouth, she couldn't help but feel the stark contrast between this moment and the perfectly orchestrated dinners she had become so accustomed to. Her previous life, those polished, upscale meals in exclusive restaurants, had always felt like performance. The silverware was too fine, the napkins too crisp, the conversation too hollow. The food had always been secondary to the deal, the connection always forced, a tool to reach a desired outcome. But here, in the small, cluttered diner, there was no facade, no highbrow expectations. Just food, just people. The simplicity of the meal, grilled cheese and tomato soup, felt grounding, like a pull back to something fundamental, something she'd ignored for so long. It wasn't just the food, it was the space they shared while eating. The way Michael and Emma interacted with one another, so effortlessly, so comfortably, reminded Sarah of something she had long overlooked. She took another spoonful of soup, the warmth of it spreading through her,
and found herself lingering in the sensation, as if trying to capture the simplicity of it. Grilled cheese, tomato soup, pie. Nothing complicated, nothing calculated. As Sarah chewed thoughtfully, her mind wandered back to her own dinners, the ones that had become more like work than anything resembling nourishment. The endless rounds of business talk over meals in chic, overpriced restaurants. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten without some hidden agenda behind it. A quick business meeting, a follow-up call disguised as a dinner date, a negotiation masked as a casual meal. Even the dinners with her so-called friends were laced with undercurrents of status and expectation. How many times had she sat at a table, carefully choosing her words, maintaining her composure, thinking only of how to keep herself a step ahead?
The contrast between those meals and this one, this quiet dinner with Michael and Emma, felt jarring. The conversation around her now was about Emma's school project, about how she was learning to read more challenging books. The topics were simple, innocent, and yet Sarah found herself hanging on to every word. She realized she hadn't had a conversation like this in so long. Nothing had been about performance. Nothing had been about making sure the right image was projected. Is this what I've been missing? The questions settled in her mind, uncomfortable but undeniable. She glanced up at Michael as he spoke to Emma with such calm attention, his eyes soft with affection. There was no rush in his voice, no urgency to get through the meal so they could get on to the next thing. There was only a moment shared between father and daughter. Something pure, something real. Sarah's grip on her spoon tightened, but not out of frustration this time. She felt a quiet stir inside, something she couldn't name but knew was important. The years she'd spent cultivating her career, building her empire, had been filled with noise, with the constant need to keep moving forward, to never stop for fear of being left behind. But in this moment, surrounded by the simplicity of a humble meal and the easy connection between father and daughter, she felt like an outsider in her own life. The discomfort that had settled in her chest earlier was no longer just about the small-town setting or the lack of control she felt in the garage. It was about something deeper. The realization that her world, her life, had been so busy, too busy for connection, for moments like this, for a meal shared with people who didn't want anything from her, who didn't care about her title or her wealth, but simply wanted her presence. As the meal progressed, Sarah couldn't help but notice how easy it all seemed for them. Michael and Emma laughed, teased each other, enjoyed the moment. She had always prided herself on her ability to handle anything, to juggle responsibilities, to control her environment. But in the quiet of this diner, with the smell of soup filling the air and the sound of Emma's laughter echoing softly, Sarah felt like she had been running on empty for far too long. There had been no room for this in her life, no room for real moments. She paused mid-bite, the simplicity of it all washing over her, and the weight of that realization pressed heavily on her chest. She wasn't just disconnected from this meal, she was disconnected from life itself, real life, the life where things didn't have to be perfect, where connection and presence were more important than power and prestige. As Michael and Emma continued their easy banter, Sarah felt herself drawn to their world, to the peace that seemed to settle over them like a soft blanket. Her mind flashed to her office, to the sleek glass walls that separated her from everything real and human, to the sterile corners of her penthouse apartment that had once been a symbol of her success, but now felt more like a cage. To the endless meetings, the back-to-back calls, the hours spent chasing something that now seemed so far away from what mattered. She hadn't realized it before, but the pace she had set for herself had kept her so far removed from what truly mattered. What was the point of all the ambition, all the success, if it led to this emptiness?
What was the point if she had no one to share it with? What had she really gained beyond money and status? The questions, though unspoken, hung in the air between her and the quiet dinner unfolding in front of her. The simplicity of the meal, the ease of Michael and Emma's connection, it all felt like a gentle reminder of what Sarah had been neglecting. Her spoon hovered above the bowl, and she found herself still. The discomfort she'd felt earlier had morphed into something else, a recognition. She didn't have the answers yet, but she understood something now, something she hadn't allowed herself to admit before. Maybe I've been chasing the wrong thing. The thought made her throat tighten, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like the beginning of something new. The tranquil hum of Milbrook, the small-town rhythm that had quietly settled around Sarah, was shattered by the abrupt growl of an engine. The sound of Richard's car cutting through the wet streets was unmistakable, a sleek black sedan, its polished chrome reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. The contrast between the quiet, weathered town and the sterile luxury of Richard's arrival was immediate and jarring. Sarah had just stepped out of the diner with Michael and Emma, the taste of simple food still lingering on her tongue, when she saw the familiar car pulling up. Her stomach sunk, though she couldn't quite explain why. Richard Harris, dressed in his usual perfectly tailored suit, climbed out of the car with his usual air of superiority. His movements were precise, deliberate, each step taken with the confident swagger of someone who always believed the world should bend to his will. "Sarah, Sarah, Sarah," Richard called out before even reaching her, his voice dripping with feigned charm, though the smile on his lips was anything but warm. "I have to say, I didn't expect you to be wasting your time out here. This town looks, well, quaint, I suppose." His eyes swept the surroundings with thinly veiled disdain, lingering just a little too long on the small, weather-beaten buildings, the cracked sidewalks, the humble cars parked along the road. Sarah could feel the heat rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain composed, trying to hold on to the sense of calm that had been growing in her since she stepped away from her fast-paced, demanding world. Richard, of course, had no such restraint. He moved closer, brushing off his suit as if the very air in Milbrook was beneath him. His gaze flicked briefly to Michael, who was standing beside Sarah, and then to the small, welcoming town that Sarah had spent the evening quietly embracing. The air of superiority radiating off of him was so thick it practically choked the space between them. "Seriously, Sarah? What exactly are you doing out here?" Richard's voice was louder now, the question meant to dig into her, an accusation wrapped in sarcasm. "You know we have a deal to close in Chicago, right? You can't be seriously planning to miss it." His words were heavy with judgment, as though he couldn't possibly fathom why anyone would leave the corporate world behind for a place like this. This town, these people, they don't even know what real business looks like. Michael's hand instinctively clenched into a fist, and for a moment Sarah saw the sharp flash of tension in his eyes, but he didn't speak. Instead, he simply watched Richard, his silence a stark contrast to the force Richard was unleashing. Sarah's stomach churned, the familiar bite of anger rising in her chest, and yet she couldn't shake the pull of the peace she had found here. A small part of her, however, still hesitated. Her loyalties, her responsibilities, they were all still tied to her corporate world. Richard had a point. The meeting tomorrow was critical. The company was at stake. If she didn't attend, there could be repercussions. A sinking feeling in her gut reminded her of the weight of all that responsibility, all that pressure.
Richard continued, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Sarah. He stepped closer,
his gaze never leaving Michael. "And you," he nodded dismissively in Michael's direction, "I assume you're the one responsible for fixing the car, right?" That's funny. Never would have thought a place like this would have someone capable enough to handle such a thing. His tone was cold, laced with derision, as if everything about this small-town mechanic was a joke. Didn't even know people like you existed in places like this. Sarah felt an involuntary sharpness prick her skin. Her eyes narrowed. The familiarity of Richard's tone, so cold, so dismissive, felt like a slap to the face, an immediate reminder of the world she was supposed to belong to, the world she was expected to uphold, the world where status, wealth, and influence dictated everything, even how people treated each other. Her thoughts raced. She was right here, in this small, authentic space, and yet Richard's words reminded her of what was at stake back in her world. How could she balance the two? How could she reconcile the power she wielded in the corporate world with the quiet peace she was beginning to discover in Milbrook? She glanced back at Michael, whose expression had shifted slightly, his jaw tight, but his posture still calm, unwavering. He wasn't rattled by Richard's words, by the high-handedness that dripped from every syllable. But Sarah, she could feel herself slipping back into that world, back into the role that had been assigned to her, the expectations that defined who she was supposed to be. Richard's smug grin widened when Sarah didn't immediately respond, his posture exuding confidence, as if he had already won. He had this way about him, this way of making everything feel like a transaction, like an equation to be solved. Move the pieces, get the result. That was his world, and it had always been hers. "Look, Sarah," Richard said, his voice softening as he leaned closer, just enough to close the gap. "This is cute and all, but I can't say I'm thrilled to see you wasting time here. There's too much at stake." His words were pointed, deliberate, the promise of consequence hanging in the air between them. "You're the one who has the power to move things forward, not him, not this place." Sarah felt the weight of Richard's words push against her, the familiar tug of corporate loyalty pulling at her chest. The power to move things forward. She knew exactly what he meant. She had spent years convincing herself that her role was about doing exactly that, about pushing forward, regardless of everything else. But standing here now, watching Michael and Emma share their quiet life, feeling the tension between Richard's world and this one, she was starting to feel the cracks in the foundation of her convictions. But Richard didn't notice. He was too busy pressing forward, forcing her hand, drawing her back into the world where everything was a calculation. He was the embodiment of everything she had been running from, and yet here he was, holding her to it like a tether she hadn't been able to escape from. "Why don't you just come back, Sarah? Come back where you belong," he continued, his voice smooth and calculated, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. "No more of this small-town nonsense, no more waiting." His words were a reminder of what she was supposed to be, of what she had always been. The pressure she had been trying to escape, the weight of responsibility, the drive to always be in control, it was all creeping back into her, and for the first time, Sarah didn't know if she could fight it. But then she glanced at Michael again, standing there, unaffected by Richard's mockery. His silence spoke volumes, a stark contrast to Richard's loud, dismissive presence. Michael didn't need to explain himself. He didn't need to justify his world to anyone. He just was. And in that moment, Sarah felt the tug of something more profound than the expectations of her corporate world. Her heart pounded against her chest, and she could feel the tension rising within her. This was a choice between the cold, calculating world Richard represented and the simple, steady warmth of the life she was beginning to understand in Milbrook. A decision was upon her, a decision that could change everything. The room seemed to shrink around Sarah as Richard's words continued to press down on her, suffocating her like a weight she couldn't escape. He stood there, tall and imposing, his suit pressed perfectly, the very embodiment of the world Sarah had spent so many years building. But as his words hit her, cold, dismissive, full of entitlement, something in Sarah stirred, a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. For a moment, she felt paralyzed, caught between the two worlds. Richard, with his sharp edge and corporate polish, was a symbol of everything she had come to rely on. His words carried the weight of years spent climbing the corporate ladder. The knowledge that money, power, and influence could make anything happen. Get back to the game, he was telling her. Don't waste time on things that don't matter. He saw her as an extension of that world, as someone who existed only to serve its needs, to push forward no matter the cost. But standing there, watching Michael in his quiet confidence, Sarah felt a strange stirring, something unfamiliar but undeniable. Michael didn't need validation, didn't need to fight for status or success. He was simply present. And that presence, that grounded simplicity, was now clashing against the cold, calculating force of Richard's world. It was then that Sarah felt it, a sudden shift in her chest, a surge of heat that rose up like fire, burning away the doubts that had once held her back. The realization crashed through her like a wave. She didn't have to live by Richard's rules anymore. She didn't have to stay in a world where everything was about control, about winning at all costs. She had the power to choose, to speak, to stand her ground. Her breath caught, and for the first time, she didn't care about the consequences. She didn't care about what Richard might say or how much he might ridicule her. She could feel it, the weight of her voice, the strength in the words that had already begun to form in her mind. It was like a dam had broken, and everything that had been building up inside of her, everything she had held back in her pursuit of success, was now flooding to the surface. She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the pavement as she closed the distance between herself and Richard, her eyes locking onto his with a newfound clarity. "Stop," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady, though it trembled with an intensity that caught even her off guard. Richard blinked, momentarily thrown off guard by her words. He was used to people deferring to him, to bending to his will, but Sarah wasn't bending now. "You don't get it, Richard," Sarah continued, her tone firm now, gaining strength with each word. "This town, this life, it's not a waste of time. And Michael, he's not someone you can just dismiss because he doesn't fit into your little world. He's real." The words spilled out in a rush, unfiltered, like a dam that had been waiting to burst. She wasn't used to speaking this way, to confronting someone like Richard, who had always been a fixture in her corporate life, a voice of authority that had always carried weight. But now, as her chest rose and fell with the surge of adrenaline, she realized that the weight of his words didn't matter to her anymore. Richard's eyes narrowed as he processed her response, a smirk creeping at the edges of his lips, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Oh, I get it. You're having one of those moments, huh?" He chuckled, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "This is cute, really, but it doesn't change anything. You've got a meeting in Chicago, Sarah. You've got a future to secure. Don't let a mechanic and his daughter distract you from what really matters." The words stung, but they didn't hold the same power over her anymore. They used to. They used to make her feel small, like every decision, every word she said had to be measured against the corporate expectations, against what people like Richard thought of her. But now, as she stood there feeling her pulse quicken with each beat, Sarah knew something had shifted inside her. "I don't care about your future plans, Richard," she said, her voice cutting through the tension between them. "I've been living in your world for too long, and for what? To climb higher? To keep proving myself to people who don't even care about what really matters?" Her heart was pounding now, but it wasn't fear she was feeling. It was something new. It was the thrill of finally saying what she had been too afraid to say for years, the freedom of realizing she didn't have to live by anyone's standards but her own. Richard's smirk faltered as Sarah stepped even closer, her eyes no longer hesitant, no longer apologetic. She wasn't the woman who had walked into this small town hours ago, unsure of what she was doing or why she was even here. She was someone different now. Someone who knew she didn't need to apologize for taking a step back from the world she had created. She took a deep breath, her voice steady now, despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. I'm not going back to that world, not the way I was living. You can keep your meetings, your endless drive to climb higher, your obsession with winning. I'm done. The finality of her words landed with a quiet weight in the air. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah felt the true weight of her own power. The power of choosing, of standing up for something that wasn't just about success, but about authenticity, about choosing to be real. Richard's eyes were wide now, his mouth slightly agape as he processed her words. He had expected her to cave, to fall back into the role he knew so well. But Sarah wasn't that woman anymore.
She felt it, the release, the lift in her chest, as if some invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and liberating all at once. She had challenged Richard. She had stood up to the very forces that had once defined her life. And she had won. For the first time in years, Sarah wasn't playing a part. She wasn't playing to anyone's expectations. The thought was exhilarating. Her voice softened just a little, but the fire behind it remained. This isn't about you or the company. This is about what I need. And right now, I need something more than your cold calculations and your corporate game. Richard stood there, his mouth opening and closing, as if he were searching for the right words to respond. But in the silence that followed, Sarah realized that, for the first time, she had nothing left to prove. She had found her voice, and it was hers to keep.
The room was tense, but not in the way it used to be. The air that had once felt charged with anticipation, excitement, and purpose now felt thick with something else: pressure. A pressure Sarah hadn't anticipated. For the first time, the bright, polished walls of the corporate world that had once felt like her kingdom seemed to close in on her, suffocating her with the weight of its expectations. She had conquered this world, she had mastered it, but now, for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to play by its rules anymore. She sat down, her movements deliberate but slower than usual. The chair was cool beneath her, the fabric of her suit uncomfortably tight, as though it were a second skin she no longer fit. She smoothed the creases of her skirt as she straightened up, taking a moment to collect herself. The table stretched out before her, lined with her colleagues, the very people she had spent years impressing, maneuvering, commanding. They were the people who had always looked to her for direction, for decisions that would ensure their own climb up the corporate ladder, and she had delivered, until now. Richard spoke first, his voice cutting through the stillness of the room. "Well, Sarah," he began, his words dripping with condescension, "I trust you're ready to get back to business. I hope you've had enough of your little vacation in Milbrook." He smirked, his eyes narrowing just slightly, as if he were baiting her. "Time's ticking. This merger isn't going to wait around for you to have your little emotional epiphanies." Sarah's stomach clenched, the harshness of his words settling deep inside her. His voice, once familiar, now felt foreign, like a sound from a distant past. The man who had once been her ally, her equal in the world of power and influence, now felt like a symbol of everything she was beginning to resent, everything she was beginning to question.
The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to Sarah, waiting for her response. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, and she felt a familiar rush of adrenaline course through her veins. This was her world. She had mastered it, and yet in that instant it felt like a heavy weight around her shoulders, a weight that had grown unbearable. Richard's eyes were on her, his expression expectant. He was ready for her to get back to business, ready for her to snap back into the role she had always played. The CEO who had all the answers, who made decisions with ruthless efficiency. The woman who knew how to command the room. The woman who had spent years creating this life, a life where everything was carefully controlled, every outcome predictable. But as Sarah sat there, her hands gripping the edge of the table, she felt the walls she had built around herself, walls of ambition, of status, of power, beginning to crack. Her mind raced back to Milbrook, to the small, unassuming garage, to the meal she had shared with Michael and Emma. The warmth of that simple moment, the simplicity of their lives, felt so far removed from this cold, calculating environment. The words she had spoken to Richard felt like a distant memory, as though they had come from someone else, someone she used to be. Her thoughts drifted, fleeting and disjointed, as she tried to bring herself back to the present. What's she really doing here? Was this the life she had worked so hard to build, only to find herself suffocating under its weight? The accolades, the respect, the success, what had it really brought her? Her relationships were fleeting at best. She had pushed people away, consumed by her obsession with climbing higher, achieving more, outpacing everyone around her. But in the silence of Milbrook, surrounded by the simplicity of Michael's world, something had clicked. Something had shifted. Her mind flickered back to the dinner, the conversation with Michael and Emma, the way they had shared a simple meal without pretense, without agendas, the way they had been present with each other, fully engaged in the moment. Sarah hadn't known how desperately she had longed for that kind of connection until she had felt it, so raw and unguarded.
Her heart began to race as the internal conflict tore through her. On one hand, there was Richard, his world, her world, defined by success, by achievement, by relentless drive. On the other, there was Milbrook, a world she was just beginning to understand. A world where success wasn't measured by power, but by the relationships you built, by the moments you allowed yourself to be part of. Richard's voice cut through her thoughts again. "Sarah, we've been patient. We've waited long enough. If you're not going to get it together and get back to work, I'll handle things from here. You've made your point." The words stung, but they also triggered something deeper inside her, a surge of clarity. The pressure, the weight, the years of sacrifices she had made to climb the ladder, all of it had led her here, to a boardroom surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than a cog in the machine. And she realized, with an unexpected jolt, that it wasn't just the deal, the merger, or the company that mattered anymore. It was the life she had neglected, the life she was finally beginning to understand was worth more than all the success she had achieved. She stood up, her movement steady, but with a newfound purpose. She felt the eyes of the room on her, the weight of their expectations, but this time it didn't matter. She wasn't playing by their rules anymore. "I'm done," she said, her voice clear, the words spilling out with an ease she hadn't anticipated. "I've been living in this world for far too long, and I'm done." The room fell silent. Richard's expression was a mix of surprise and disbelief. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rising. "This is your company, Sarah. You don't just walk away from it. You don't just give up."
Her heart pounded, but it wasn't fear she felt. It was freedom, the exhilaration of finally listening to her own voice. "I'm walking away, Richard. From this life, from this world. I'm choosing something else." The words felt foreign on her lips, but they felt true. They felt right. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. The life she had built, so carefully, so strategically, wasn't what she wanted anymore. She didn't need it. She didn't need him. "I've spent so long chasing success," she continued, her voice steady now.
But I've come to realize that it isn't everything. Not anymore." There was a moment of stunned silence before Richard finally spoke, his voice hard, cold, like a blade. "You'll regret this. You can't walk away from everything you've built. You're nothing without it." Sarah stood her ground, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her decision. But now it felt like she was standing on solid ground for the first time in years. She wasn't walking away from who she was. She was walking toward who she wanted to become. "I'm not nothing," she said softly, but with conviction. "I'm finally someone." Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.